Thank you for all gathering for our second session of the day, kicked off brilliantly by our first energizing, fabulous session. My name is Sonja Drimmer, and I teach medieval art at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, just an hour away from here. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our three speakers for today's session. Our third speaker will be joining us virtually, but our first two are here live and in the flesh. And our first speaker is Lloyd de Beer. Lloyd de Beer is medieval curator at the British Museum and director of the British Archaeological Association. In 2021, he co-curated the blockbuster exhibition, Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint, and he co-authored the award-winning, so they won an award from the Historians of British Art, the award-winning accompanying catalog. And I have to say, I was unable to travel to see the exhibition, much to my great dismay, but that catalog is... It deserves every award. It was really magnificent. So Lloyd is currently working on two projects. The first is a monograph, English Alabaster Sculpture in the Middle Ages, Imagery, Trade, Iconoclasm, Reuse. And he has a 3-year British Academy-funded fellowship exploring the material connections between England and West Africa in the Middle Ages and early modern period. I should tell you that his paper today has an updated title, so it's different from what you see on your programs and online. His paper today is called The Chertsey Tiles, the Middle Ages, and the British Museum. Please join me in welcoming Lloyd.
Thank you, Sonja. Can everyone hear me? Great. Yeah, thank you, Sonja. Thank you, Amanda, so much for inviting me to participate. And many congratulations on the exhibition and the book. It's really a phenomenal success. I updated my title because, as many of you know, when you suggest a title and then you come to write your paper, you realize you can only deal with about a third of what you said you would. So it was past, present, and future, and what you're getting is past. And maybe you'll get present and future at another date. Right. Okay, 20 minutes, let's go. On the 6th of November, 1987, the groundbreaking exhibition, Age of Chivalry, Art in Plantagenet England, 1200 to 1400, opened at the Royal Academy in London. It was one of the first times since their acquisition that the British Museum had lent the Chertsey tiles, and here, in the low light of the Royal Academy's galleries, spotlit on the right-hand side of the wall, are the famous pair. The imagined crusading victory of the English king Richard I over Saladin. Below them, at the center of the room, is a carved wooden effigy of another crusading hero, Robert Curto, son of William the Conqueror. And amazingly, they borrowed this from Gloucester. Is he still inside? I mean, what? Robert's military effigy, like the depiction of Richard's victory in the Chertsey tiles, is retrospective rather than contemporary, pumped up for full dramatic effect. And the juxtaposition of these objects in the exhibition was an invitation to visitors to consider the ways in which historical figures and events were reinterpreted in the Middle Ages. Motivated by the sea change taking place in art history, the curators of the exhibition, Jonathan Alexander and Paul Binsky, gravitated towards the social history of art. They sought to situate works like the Chertsey tiles in their proper social, political, and patronal contexts, and not simply within a stylistic developmental trajectory, which had been the central premise of the exhibition English Romanesque Art, its predecessor by only 3 years. And that's actually kind of amazing when you look at those two catalogs, that there's just 3 years between them, because it feels like 20 or 25 years. And Paul Crossley wrote a very interesting piece looking at the history of these exhibitions at the time that Gothic Art for England opened at the V&A. It's an interesting article. As progressive as Age of Chivalry was, there was little sense of the greater global connections at play, issues which lie at the heart of Amanda's exhibition, Bringing the Holy Land Home. That such connections can today be argued for through the reconstruction of a group of 13th century floor tiles from an English abbey is demonstrative of a current scholarly imperative to redefine the study of the Middle Ages. What developments like this ultimately mean for the way that we think about presenting objects at the British Museum and elsewhere, of course, is an ongoing conversation and definitely one to keep having over the next couple of days. But in order to understand how interpretation of the tiles has changed over time, it is necessary to return to the moment of their discovery and question what the status of the Middle Ages was then. As we will see, this was a pivotal moment for the British Museum, for Britain, and for Europe more broadly, especially regarding how and why medieval objects were collected and displayed. When the first significant fragments of the Chertsey pavement were accidentally discovered in 1852, the BM's medieval collection was practically non-existent, and there was no one among the trustees with any inclination to push for their acquisition. Some tiles had emerged from Chertsey in the 1780s and the 1820s, but it was not until the 1850s that the greatest number were unearthed. At that time, the Chertsey estate was owned by one Mr. Samuel Grumbridge, who, during a search for stones for building work, came across a concrete floor under which the broken tile fragments were found. Today, such a discovery might make national news, but that was not the case in 1852, at which time the tiles were uncarefully and unceremoniously placed to one side. Some were even removed and later disappeared. It was only through another fortunate accident that the tiles were saved. In 1853, a key actor in our drama, the physician Dr. Man-Waring-Sherlock, I promise you, I'm not making up Mr. Samuel Grumbridge and Dr. Man-Waring-Sherlock. He moved to Chertsey from Eynsham, Oxfordshire. He dabbled in antiquarianism and had some time before moving to Chertsey discovered and recorded tiles from Eynsham Abbey, many of which he later donated to the BM. And this is a line drawing of one of the tiles that he gave to the BM. After moving to Chertsey, he must have been on the prowl for more tiles and thus took a keen interest in the recent discoveries, which he later described as having first seen on Mr. Grumbridge's estate, quote, in a large heap of debris in his yard. In 1883, Sherlock published an illustrated book, and I'm showing you the cover of that book on the screen, called Tiles from Chertsey Abbey, which he populated with his own wonderful watercolors of the best surviving fragments. And a lot of the original watercolors are at the V&A, and you can see them online and also request to see them in their study room. However, this volume would take decades to produce, and in the meantime, Sherlock needed to get word out about the tiles that have been found at Chertsey. He knew that these tiles would be of enormous interest to architects and designers, and after recording a few examples, he sent his first drawings to George Gilbert Scott and Herbert Minton. Scott was a rising architectural star, a leading light of the Gothic revival movement. His first church, St. Giles in Camberwell, London, was built in 1844, and I'm showing you an image of that church. And it was praised for its scientific approach to the Gothic style. Herbert Minton was the owner of Minton & Co. In a similar manner to Scott's approach to architecture, he was designing new ceramic products based on research into actual medieval objects. So the tile you see on screen is obviously 19th century, but it's based on an original that was found at Westminster Abbey Chapter House. And you can see that Minton's tried to give it this pitted, kind of true medieval look. So he's really trying to interpret the objects. And this was used at Temple Church for his renovation. Following Sherlock's invitation, both Scott and Minton visited him in Chertsey in 1853 to see the tiles and immediately pushed for further investigation into the site and ultimately for acquisition and display by the British Museum. Despite the clear significance of the tiles to individuals like Sherlock, Scott, and Minton, the BM at first refused the donation, and it would be 30 years before they changed their mind. It was obviously a frustrating situation. In the early 1850s, the BM was, in reality, the only British museum where such a large group of medieval objects might be deposited and put on show. What would later become known as the Victoria and Albert Museum was still in the process of being founded in the wake of the Great Exhibition of 1851. The BM's reluctance to acquire, make room for, and display medieval material, or what was then called national antiquities, was a matter of great concern and anxiety, and these were issues which really predated the discovery of the Chertsey tiles. In 1845, the antiquarian Thomas Wright published his polemic, The Archaeological Album, or Museum of National Antiquities, where he despaired of the British Museum. In the British Museum, I quote, "Our native antiquities appear to be held in very little esteem. It is discreditable to the government of this country that we have no museum of national antiquities." Similar sentiments can be traced among numerous other antiquarians, artists, and architects. In 1844, the architect E.B. Lamb wrote that, quote, "It is singular that the national art should be considered so little of in the National Museum. Several packing cases of marble fragments have recently been imported at great expense, and some part of the new build is to be prepared to receive them." What Lamb was referring to was the rebuilding of the British Museum by Robert Smirke, which opened just a few years before the discovery at Chertsey. I'm showing the image of Smirke's building, which is the one that you'll see if you visit today. A guidebook from 1850, and I'm showing you the guidebook in question here, reveals that in this new building, just 13 cases were allotted for all of European prehistory up to the end of the Middle Ages. The author of the guidebook's framing of these objects alongside the BM's ethnographic collection was deeply racist, but also typical of the way in which prehistory in particular was presented at the time. And there's definitely something to be said at another conference about the collecting of ethnographic material and medieval material by the very same people at the British Museum. And I quote from the guidebook, "The 13 cases ought to be looked at last of all, representing as they do a condition of semi-civilized life in which we cannot fail to be more deeply interested in than that of Americans, Africans, or Asiatics, the barbarism, namely, of our own European ancestors. The cases are thus briefly designated in the catalogue, various British and medieval antiquities temporarily deposited in this room, and it is certainly desired that the collection were rich enough to fill a separate department." Following the discovery of the Chertsey tiles, public pressure was ramped up. In 1858, in a piece in The Builder, a leading architectural journal, the Gothic Revival architect William Burgess called out the British Museum publicly, painting a picture of the institution as antiquated and out of step with the feeling of a current generation. Quote, "They and the elder officers regard the functions of the museum in a very different light to what the rising generation do. With us, the museum is a repository of things for the purposes of study. With them, it is simply a collection of curiosities, stuffed birds, beasts, and fishes, Elgin marbles, and New Zealand coal-scuttle bonnets made out of tortoise shell. Having got some few specimens of the Chertsey tiles presented to them, enough was done to satisfy curiosity, and they very consistently declined to purchase the collection." These few specimens to which Burgess refers were donated to the BM in 1853 by one of their newest employees, the young, handsome, Cambridge graduate Augustus Wollaston Franks, also a very strange name, who had been appointed as an assistant keeper to the Department of Antiquities in 1851. At that time, the term antiquities was a coverall for any object that wasn't a book, document, or natural history. It encompassed coins, medals, Greek, Roman, Egyptian ethnographic collections, and so on and so forth. There were obvious hierarchies, as you might imagine, Greco-Roman and Egyptian sitting at the very pinnacle. Franks was, reluctantly on the part of the trustees, brought onto the staff with a special mandate to begin collecting national antiquities, the very first person ever employed to do so. But he was also a tile enthusiast and passed his summer holidays before being appointed to the BM, traveling across Britain by rail and tracing floor tiles. The example that you can see on screen is one of his from Tintern Abbey. Imagine how much fun that must have been. Franks must have hoped that the Chertsey tiles he provided to the BM would be the first of many to arrive in the museum, but his low status as a junior employee meant that it wasn't to be. So, instead of going to the BM, Sherlock's entire collection of the tiles was first given to another museum, the Architectural Museum, set up by George Gilbert Scott, a predecessor of the Cast Court at the V&A. And the tiles would remain here for 30 years before they were then transferred to Bloomsbury. So I'm just showing these really as images of what that museum looked like. So, what caused the change of heart at the BM? To appoint a curator with specific interest in the Middle Ages, and to allow him at least a little bit of space and room to begin building a collection. To understand why, we need to briefly turn back to the 18th century. In 1753, the BM was founded by an Act of Parliament. The impetus for its creation was the shift into public ownership of several large private libraries, as well as collections of natural history and antiquities, those of Hans Sloane, Robert Cotton, and Robert and Edward Harley. On one hand, the Middle Ages sat at the very heart of this first museum. It was now home to extraordinary illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels, and documents, such as a rare original 1215 Magna Carta, both of which came through Cotton. The Guthlac roll came from the Harleys, and from Sloane, a practicing physician, came medical manuscripts, such as John Arden's Book of Medicine. But medieval objects, I know books and documents are objects too, but I'm just differentiating in the way that they differentiated in the 18th century. And this is a decorative art, sculpture, archaeological finds, etc. They were few and far between in the early museum. With Cotton's books and charters came medieval coins, as well as a griffin's claw purported to be from Durham Cathedral. And some of you might have seen this. We lent this to Beth's show at the Getty on Bastries. More medieval objects arrived through Sloane. A 12th century Morse ivory seal of St. Albans Abbey, the Sword of State, an early English astrolabe, and an ivory horn with a depiction of an armillary sphere made on the west coast of Africa for the Portuguese market. Apart from the small number of items which arrived at these founding collections, there was little further effort by the BM to acquire any medieval objects, that is, ones which weren't books or documents, and any suggestion of such an idea was actively rejected by the trustees. The greatest effort for the latter part of the 18th century and early 19th century was spent building its library collections, as well as its principal antiquities, which were primarily Greco-Roman. For instance, in 1772, the BM acquired Sir William Hamilton's collection of vases acquired during his time as British ambassador to Naples. But Hamilton also acquired medieval objects in Italy, a Limoges casket of the martyrdom of St. Thomas Becket, which went instead to the Society of Antiquaries. To help us visualize when and how many medieval acquisitions the BM was making, I've made this graph which takes us from just before its foundation all the way up to the present day, with the date running horizontally and the number of objects vertically. This is just medieval, just for medieval objects. It shows that there was little activity between the foundation date and the mid-19th century, after which there were two major concentrated periods, the first between 1852 and 1914, and the other between 1960 and 2000. And that would be the kind of, for another talk, that latter part of the slide. There were a few significant acquisitions before 1850, such as the St. Stephen's Chapel paintings from Westminster Palace, donated in 1814, or more famously, the Lewis hoard of chess pieces acquired following their discovery in 1831. And then the large spike in the graph before 1850 is at 1841. It is for the Viking Age Curdale hoard of silver discovered on the banks of the Ribble, Lancashire, passed to the BM by Queen Victoria, who, to be frank, wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. During the first half of the 19th century, the BM was focused on acquiring large collections of Grand Tour masterpieces, mostly assembled by British collectors in the 18th century. The ongoing Napoleonic Wars made it difficult to travel abroad. The most significant acquisition, as many of you will know, was the collection of Charles Townley's classical marbles, seen here in his private gallery painted by Johann Zoffany. What some of you might not know, I mean some of you might know this, is that the low status afforded to the BM, Middle Ages at the BM, meant that acquisitions were also missed out on. Townley also had in his collection Abbot Suger's chalice from Saint-Denis, which it seems the BM stupidly passed on, which now resides in the National Gallery of Art in DC. Moments of peace during the Napoleonic Wars allowed objects to move between the continent and Britain. In 1802, the Treaty of Amiens brought the Rosetta Stone to London. The marble lions on screen made their way, made by André Bonneveau for the tomb of Charles V at Saint-Denis, also made their way from Paris to London that same year. They were bought by the British aristocrat Thomas Neave, probably from Alexandre Lenoir, who had been saving medieval objects from destruction. Objects like Bonnevau's lions and Suger's chalice were simply not within the collecting purview of the BM trustees at the time. They were, however, a primary focus of the Parisian collector, Alexandre du Sommerard, who, in the second quarter of the 19th century, built up an enormous collection of French national antiquities, all of which he placed in the Hôtel de Cluny, which he likewise saved from destruction. At his death in 1842, the collection was given to the French state, and thus a public museum of national antiquities was set up in France, becoming an additional source of anxiety for British antiquarians who saw their government and their national museum doing nothing. And it's worth pointing out, for the bigger picture, that during the first half of the 19th century, a whole host of European capitals now boasted national museums, which focused primarily on collecting and displaying national antiquities: the National Museum in Budapest, the National Museum of Denmark, the National Museum in Prague, and the Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg. So, what does all of this mean for the BM and the Chertsey tiles? How do we tie this up? Their discovery in 1852 clearly coincided with a broader European-wide move to collect and display medieval objects as part of independent nationalist projects. The decision to appoint Augustus Franks at the BM was a key moment in its history in relation to this curatorial nationalism. But it would be unwise to simply write Franks off as insular. He might have been brought on as a medievalist with a focus on national antiquities, but he would go on to become a significant collector and expert in Japanese and Chinese ceramics, Indian sculpture, ethnography, European prehistory, and Romano-British archaeology, and of course the arts of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. By the time he retired in 1896, Franks had completely transformed the BM's collections. It must have meant something very personal to him that he was able, eventually in 1885, to bring the Chertsey tiles from the Architectural Museum to the BM. In one respect, curators like Franks were exploring the global Middle Ages in the 19th century, but theirs was one firmly embedded in and refracted through British and European colonial activity abroad. In moving forward, Amanda's project offers us a way to rethink star objects from the BM's collection and how we might represent them in the future. But how we understand the discovery and acquisition of such objects is, I think, equally important to whatever story it is we wish to tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lloyd. Highlights included those names. I will never forget Mainwaring Sherlock. So as our next presenter's slides come up, allow me to present him. Dr. Euan Roger is Principal Medieval Specialist at the National Archives in Kew in the UK, specializing in the records of late medieval and early Tudor English government, the central law courts, and the secular clergy, with a particular interest in social, medical, material, and administrative history. Euan's research to date has focused on the history of pre-modern religious communities, as well as on medieval hospitals, infectious disease in pre-modern England, and the life records of the poet Geoffrey Chaucer. And many of you may be familiar with the very high-profile and significant events of the recovery of some documents earlier this year that Euan helped to bring to light and interpret. Recently, he was co-curator of the major exhibition at the National Archives, Treason, People, Power, and Plot, exploring 700 years of treason since its legal definition in 1352. He was also co-author of the book, A History of Treason, which accompanied the exhibition, and his work has featured in publications including The New York Times, Time Magazine, The Guardian, and The Times. I assume that's the Times of London. He has researched and written about Chertsey Abbey for much of the past decade and has produced several educational resources on the medieval abbey. And I will only interject with my own comment to say that for many people on the outside, the National Archives can seem like a sort of distant and imposing institution, but Euan has done a tremendous amount in opening it up to the public and making it feel like a welcoming, friendly place that wants to really collaborate with members of the public and the scholarly community. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Euan Roger.
Thank you for those very kind comments, and thank you to Amanda for inviting me to speak here today. So, I want to start with this account by an 18th century antiquary visiting the site of Chertsey Abbey, because I think it really brings out some of the challenges around researching the Abbey's long history. I first went with eager steps to view the Abbey, rather the site of the Abbey, for so total a dissolution I scarcely ever saw. Of that noble and splendid pile, nothing remains, scarcely a little of the outer wall. I left the ruined ruins of this place with a sigh for the loss of so much national magnificence and national history. So in the 20 minutes available to me, I want to give a kind of overview of the Abbey's long history, because I think it's really important to understand that wider context, particularly the Abbey's links with the wider secular world. So, situated on an island in the marshy floodplains of the River Thames in the north of Surrey, the Abbey church dedicated to St. Peter in Chertsey was founded around 666 AD by Erkenwald, the first abbot, who was later appointed Bishop of London. Now, little of that monastic complex survives today, and it's easy to forget the once grand abbey which dominated the local landscape and became one of the largest in the country. With its location close to the Thames, the lifeblood of the medieval capital and surrounding areas, the site was well suited to a large monastic community. And Erkenwald's involvement from the very start was a sign of elite patronage. From the beginning, the new abbey enjoyed royal favour. Its foundation charters state that the co-founder was Thriftwald, the subregulus, the under-king or vassal of Surrey. And by the time of the Norman conquest, the abbey had consolidated a wide-ranging landholding, both within Surrey and the neighbouring counties, as recorded in the Domesday Survey of 1086, while at the same time various privileges were also forthcoming, from the Crown, Rome, and the Papal Curia more generally. In 1068, the abbot was appointed Bishop of Rochester, and in 1110, Abbot Hugh, who rebuilt some of the abbey's buildings, was said to have been a relative of King Stephen. At the end of the 11th century, Abbot Hugh was one of those chosen to accompany the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Norwich on a visit. And a century later, in 1198, as the events of the First Crusade and the Siege of Antioch were unfolding, Abbot Martin was sent by Richard I to negotiate with the papacy on various ecclesiastical matters. Details of these journeys are sparse and often hidden from our view, but that the abbots were trusted with such missions demonstrates the regard for which they were held by the crown. And throughout these embassies, we see the abbots of Chertsey travelling. They could and did travel outside of their self-sufficient community. They were present in royal and papal courts, interacting with cultures, communities, and individuals from around the world. And indeed, while the combat tiles were not produced for another half century or so, it's intriguing to consider what stories, reports, and updates on the East and on the Crusades the abbots may have overheard while visiting the Papal Curia in 1198. And royal connections continued into the 13th century around the time of the tiles' production. Abbot Allen was one of those present at the final and definitive reissue of Magna Carta by Henry III in 1225, and he's named as one of the signatories on the document. And in 1273, the new king, Edward I, ordered Abbot Bartholomew to go to Kingston upon Thames to ensure that his orders concerning the cancellation of a tournament were carried out. So we're still seeing this royal connection going on through. It's perhaps Abbot John Rutherwick who ruled over the abbey from 1307 to 1346. He's perhaps the abbot we know the most about, as it was during his tenure that several new building works were undertaken and recorded in the abbey's cartularies. New income streams were appropriated in the face of a general financial downturn, and Abbot John seems to have been particularly interested in rebuilding works and generally improving the appearance of the buildings under his control. And documents witness a desire to continue to improve and embellish the abbey. In 1311, he's providing new red velvet vestments, and areas around the high altar were newly painted a few years later. Images of the saints were purchased, including Catherine and Margaret, perhaps sculpted or painted on panels, we're not sure, as well as a new pastoral staff. The abbey was being rebuilt, and it's in this period in its history that the reconstruction you'll see in the exhibition is based and founded. This is a real high point, potentially, of the abbey's history. And alongside these works, we see general building works on the abbey's dependent chapels and churches in the nearby areas of Surrey as well. Now, perhaps Abbot John's energy in the matters of acquisition and decoration may appear somewhat exaggerated to us, given the paucity of domestic records for his predecessors, but it was noted by his community on one occasion in 1335. In that year, a complaint was recorded by certain conspirators within the community before the Bishop of Winchester, stating that the abbot had acquired so many possessions, including lands, buildings, and livings, that the monks were unable to estimate their value or extent. They literally couldn't count everything he was bringing in. He seems to have mended his ways relatively quickly, as being not a little troubled in his mind, he ceased from such acquisition and rested that year from the labours of his body and the fatigues of his heart. Throughout Abbot John's tenure, Chertsey also benefited from his connections with Edward II and his queen Isabella, through which he received numbers of pardons and licenses to alienate property, while bringing further non-elite secular influences into the abbey. At this time, we have several Corodians, so people being given a living and lodgings within the community, particularly servants of the crown and members of the lay community from the local area. Now, thinking about the abbey's officials at this time, if the abbey church with its round of daily services was the liturgical hub of the house, the chapter house was its administrative and regulatory centre, and it was the abbey's main point of interaction with the wider world. Important visitors, whether religious superiors or royal dignitaries, might be received in the chapter house before being offered hospitality in the wider precinct. And of course, this is the area in which the Chertsey tiles were found. And the chapter house has been virtually recreated for the first time through Amanda's efforts and the efforts of James Comper and Chertsey Museum, supplemented by all this kind of work that's gone on in the last few years. It was a space where the religious and secular worlds might meet, where discipline and regulations were maintained, and where royal patronage was most effectively displayed, as in the Chertsey combat tiles that link the wider world, to the wider world in England and to the east. For the many visitors who would arrive at the abbey each year seeking hospitality, the tiles that decorated the abbey buildings demonstrated the prestige of the institution around them. And the main source for our knowledge of the abbey's history at this time is a series of cartularies, and you can see our copy at the National Archives on the screen here. These were important documents which contained grants, deeds, and other documents, but often acted as signifiers of status rather than as everyday working accounts. But they do provide some details of the obedientiaries, the monks with additional roles who had to kind of work in the community. Now, these are often difficult to identify precisely, and they changed over time, but we do have a few snippets from the 13th century. The cellarer at Chertsey was responsible for providing cheese to the abbey refectory, presumably other food as well, but cheese is specifically mentioned in the account as a responsibility. There was a chamberlain who received £20 from the cellarer at regular intervals to provide clothing for the community, grease to anoint the shoes of the monks who were preaching, towels for the lavatory, and the ceremony of the washing of the feet, and sandals of white cloth for the annual All Saints Vigil. And I'd love to know what some of these looked like, but sadly, the accounts we have are very limited in detail. An almoner was appointed to distribute alms to the local poor, particularly during obituary ceremonies and on special occasions. On the feast of the Blessed Mary Magdalene, he was to distribute bread, wine, and curd cheesecake, so cheese coming back in again. While abbots Adam and Alan assigned specific rents to ensure that bread, wine, and fish were distributed each year on the anniversary of their deaths. By the 14th century, a pittancer had been added to the abbey's obedientiaries, distributing small sums of money to the poor on certain occasions. And in the 16th century, we find mention of a prior and a sub-prior, as well as a subchanter, which presumably indicates the existence of a chanter. We also have a library. We know there's a library from the accounts of the abbey's demolition in the 16th century, when one William Tucker, a local smith, was paid for a day's work taking down the lead of the library, presumably part of the windows or other fittings. That they had a scriptorium is also demonstrated by the cartularies and registers. And we have these lovely drawings of a monk named Mannering, who seems to be the main hand behind the cartulary, who provides his name amongst these illustrations. So you can see in the fish in the bottom right-hand corner, he's written Mannering in that document. And he writes that a few times throughout. Now, the drawings show great variety. We have rabbits, we have monkeys, fish, this sort of half-human, half-dog creature that looks a bit like Scooby-Doo. They're nothing near the standard of the images depicted on the Chertsey tiles. But it's not outside, I don't think, the realms of possibility that the tiles and their imagery may have inspired Mannering's imagination, perhaps during a drawn-out chapter meeting, inspiring him to decorate his own work in artistic fashion. And it was interesting in the context of hearing about hunting, rabbits feature quite frequently throughout the cartulary as well. In comparison, we have this stunning coloured drawing in the cartulary showing the fields between the abbey and the nearby village of Laleham. And of course, while the primary aim of this schematic map was to record details of grazing rights and the names and sizes of individual meadows, The person who compiled it included an exceptionally detailed illustration of the Abbey church itself. It's undoubtedly stylized in many ways. For example, it appears larger inside than the entire town of nearby Laleham, but it nevertheless provides a rare insight into what the now-lost Abbey looked like in its prime. Its interior lit by candlelight and its doors open to the members of the monastic community. And in combination with images of the medieval Abbey found on a handful of surviving wax seals, this depiction forms part of the inspiration behind the digital reconstruction of the Abbey that you'll see in the exhibition. Interestingly, you may notice that the seals are slightly different to the images in the cartulary. I don't have time to go into that today, but I can answer it in the questions if anyone's interested or afterwards. Now, the Abbey perhaps reached its highest point in the 15th century, when after the death of Henry VI in the Tower of London in 1471, the body of the murdered king was taken to Chertsey and buried in the Lady Chapel on the south side of the main church. So here we can see the accounts of this body being taken from London to Chertsey. And in the images here, you can see what's left of that Lady Chapel area today. It's in someone's garden today, sadly. And it's obviously been massively reconstructed. Often described as an obscure location for the murdered king's burial, out of sight and out of mind, Chertsey may indeed have been Henry's own choice, the king having visited on several occasions during the latter years of his reign, particularly after suffering the catastrophic decline in his mental health that would affect him regularly from 1453. And it's intriguing for me to consider what Henry, a pious and gentle man, scarred by the horrors of a horrific civil war taking place around him, what he would have made of the violent subject matter of the combat tiles, which he must have seen. In any case, after Henry's death and his burial in Chertsey, the Abbey quickly became a major pilgrimage site for those wanting to visit the tomb of the late king. He'd only stay there for the next 13 years, however, as in 1484 his body was transferred to St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, most likely in an attempt to appropriate the flow of pilgrims and the income that pilgrimage could bring. Henry's body, or at least most of it, remains in Windsor to this day, despite a number of disputes around the matter at the end of the 15th century, when the abbot of Chertsey argued that the body had been taken without his consent, but he never got the body back. Now, we have little notice of relics at the Abbey until the 16th century. We've had those images of the saints, but we have little evidence for relics until we have the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. And recorded in the Compendium Compitorum, the product of a large-scale inspection of religious foundations across England in 1535, we have evidence of 2 relics at Chertsey. Among the relics they have, as they say, the arm bone of St. Blasius, through which they give wine in case of illness. There is also an image of St. Faith, before which they place a candle on behalf of sick persons, and hold that if the candle remain lighted till it is consumed, the sick person will recover. But if it goes out, he will die. So no putting that in a drafty area of the Abbey church. Not long after the events of the compendium were reported to Cromwell, the Crown undertook the greatest survey of ecclesiastical property since 1291, the Valor Ecclesiasticus. At Chertsey and at other similar houses, the abbot's own financial accounts were used in the commissioner's assessment as evidence of financial outcomes and expenditures. The final valuation of the abbey and its estates came to £659, 15 shillings, 8 3/4 pence. An impressive total. It's up there in terms of the religious communities around the country. And I love that they go down to the 3/4 pence in terms of value. It's really that detailed. Now, Chertsey Abbey surrendered to the Crown in July 1537 in anticipation that their house would be refounded at Bisham Abbey near Marlow, so just a bit up the river. The Abbey community moved to their new site in December 1537, but were left impoverished by the abbot's mismanagement, and because none of the Abbey's endowments had materialised. It's meant to be an even bigger establishment than Chertsey, but none of the money ever turns up, and the abbot goes around selling everything for wine, apparently. And 6 months after the move to Bisham, on June 19, 1538, the monks were once again forced to surrender their house to the Crown, each signing his name individually on the surrender document, with many of the names matching those monks previously recorded at Chertsey. All of the signatories, bar one, had been monks at Chertsey before the move. So it's a very rare example of this kind of community being uprooted, moved, and then having to surrender once again. And that's just the monks themselves signing their surrender at Bissum. 3 days after their surrender at Bissum, the monks' former abbey in Chertsey was partially torn down. The accounts describing its destruction include entries for the hasty expedition of certain windows and doors to Oatlands Palace in nearby Weybridge, the demolition of the church steeple, and the large stones of the church and associated buildings, although some of the entries suggest that certain abbey buildings were preserved and only granted away fully in later years. And the reason we have these accounts is because of this kind of link with Oatlands and Hampton Court, so the king is involved, hence the preservation of accounts that you wouldn't get at other similar institutions. Now, incredibly, no mention is made of the Chertsey tiles in these accounts, or of tiles of any kind. We do have 2 tilers named amongst the workmen, but no mention of tiles specifically, although the accounts are incomplete. The fact that tiles were found at the Chertsey site in later years indicates that they were either of little interest to the king and his agents, or they must have been covered up in some way before the royal workmen arrived. It's also possible that the chapter house was initially left relatively intact, with demolition focused primarily on the Abbey church, and perhaps was only demolished later, but that still brings up this question of why the tiles weren't of interest if they were there and available. Now, the destruction of the Abbey means that there are few ruined structures to see in Chertsey today, in contrast with, say, Reading Abbey, where much of the physical fabric survives to the present. I have a colleague who actually used to live in Chertsey and had no idea that there had ever been an abbey there, because there's literally one wall, which you'll see in my next slide shortly. So this obviously presents challenges when engaging with the public. And so I wanted to share, just very briefly before I finish, a couple of the educational resources that the National Archives and Chertsey Museum have used to introduce school groups and others to the Abbey's history, and to which Amanda's amazing resources will contribute in the future. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Abbey's map has been the focus of much of this activity, providing a very visual image of what the Abbey is and what its lands look like and where they were. So our educational resources explore the symbolism of the map, what it was used for, how accurate medieval mapping was, seeking to compare it particularly with modern maps, highlighting just how much has been lost from our collective view. And working with Chertsey Museum and Royal Holloway University, we've also created a series of short video resources looking at the Abbey's high and low points from a documentary perspective, the scant surviving stonework, and hints in the landscape, such as the Abbey's extant fish ponds. This is literally all of the Abbey that survived, you can see here. And for Lloyd's point earlier, my co-host in this video is named Sherlock, the little monk. So the work done by Chertsey Museum, James Comper, in reconstructing the 14th century Abbey buildings has taken the educational and interpretive potential for reimagining the history of Chertsey Abbey to new levels, as has Amanda's amazing reconstructive work presented here. And I'm very pleased to say that Amanda's brilliant resources will now be linked to in our educational resources going forward. I was hoping it would be done before I got here, but my colleague has been ill. So it's not been updated yet, but it will be soon. So needless to say, it's the collaborative spirit and potential that's been evident throughout, working with the team at Chertsey and with Amanda that's brought all of these pieces together and allowed us to view Chertsey in a whole new way. So returning to that quote I started with, is the story of Chertsey Abbey really so total a dissolution I scarcely ever saw, the loss of so much national magnificence and national history? Well, possibly. But through efforts to reconstruct and resurrect such a history, tile by tile, fragment by fragment, documentary scrap by documentary scrap, we can start to recover it. And through the newly interpreted surviving tiles and the reconstruction of the precinct in particular, we can now get a full sense for the first time of what aspects of this religious powerhouse may have looked like in its prime. Thank you very much.
So yes, we have some time for questions now. I will invite our speakers up to the front of the room. And while they're settling in and while you're thinking of your questions and who wants to be the first to speak, I'll remind you that you should use the microphone. I was reminded by the image that appeared in Amanda's talk, where we see England as an island at the edge of the known world. And one of the things that I think we saw in all three of the talks is just how profoundly that island at the edge of the known world is defining itself by its relationship to the umbilicus mundi. And that even holds true, if not necessarily to the umbilicus mundi, then to other places. Even in our first talk by Lloyd, where we see, I saw that compelling slide of the British Museum and all of these other national museums and how they're forging own definitions of themselves and their own nations. And the British Museum does it, I think, slightly differently. So to our first question, Naomi, please.
Thank you so much. So to introduce myself, hello, I'm Naomi Speakman. I'm at the British Museum, so I have a vested interest in this session. I have two questions, but firstly, thank you to all three speakers. That was fascinating. Lloyd, do we know how the tiles were exhibited at the Architectural Museum? Do we know what they were shown alongside? I don't know anything about that, so do you know anything about that? And Euan, I love that you opened with that quote by Stukely, who was going all over the place at that time. But do we know much about what the 18th century interest was in Chertsey?
It's a very good question. I don't, is a simple answer. I think at that point there is still so little remaining. A lot of it, once it becomes ruined, a lot of it finds its way into people's houses and walls nearby. Spot it if you walk around town. But I think even by that point there is so much that's lost that I think that quote is kind of reflective of the broader picture. People are still interested in Chertsey today, but perhaps not in the Abbey quite as much.
I just want to jump in, so that the longer passage that Stukely writes, you can tell he's interested in the religiosity of the period.
Yeah.
And that to him is this sort of core interest. And then there's the kind of ubi sunt emotional context for all of this has been lost. So that just to give a little more framework.
Yeah, it's all about desecration, isn't it, in his kind of long account of how horrific the dissolution was and how horrific it's been to desecrate us like that.
Thanks, Naomi. The answer is no. I don't know how they were displayed. There's no record for how they were displayed, and I've been through as many of the photographs that exist at the displays of the Architectural Museum by Mansell and Co. Again, which you can find on the Victoria and Albert's Museum collections database. But what is interesting is when they come to the BM in 1885, they don't go on display because there are a lot of fragments from Chertsey, and I think they don't know what to do with them and how to display them. So if you read the guidebooks to the BM, the synopses, they actually talk about the Chertsey tiles. They say that they've cleared an area where they would like to display them, and they hope soon to put them on display. And that starts in 1886, and every guidebook up to 1910 says exactly the same thing, and then it says nothing. But that was also around the time of the building of a new wing, what we call the Edward VII wing of the BM, where they moved the medieval displays from the kind of smirk building into a whole new gallery. And so it's possible they could have put them on display then. There are letters from man-wearing Sherlock to Augustus Franks, where he laments the fact that they haven't yet been put on display, and he hopes that they will soon. So until the 19th, I mean, it's, I tried to dig a bit into this, but didn't really have the time. But until the 1970s, when they do this resetting of them, I wonder how much, if any, were on display at any one time.
We have a queue. So can I invite our next question asker up? And if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Marianne Ailes from the University of Bristol. So first of all, thank you for such great papers. As someone who is not an art historian but a literary scholar, I'm just really enjoying the visual feast here, and also the unusual experience of being at a conference with no responsibilities. I was particularly excited to see Cleverly on the screen. It is such an extraordinary scheme of images, pretty well unparalleled in England, I think, although as art historians you'll know better than I do. I just wondered if Matthew could say any more about possible literary, textual inspirations behind it. For me, the Flowering Glance is just the Pseudoterpene Chronicle, basically. So I would suggest that that's possibly where the Roland idea comes from as well.
I agree with you. I think it probably is pseudoterpene, to be honest with you. But this is a project that I've kind of dog-eared as something to come back to in the very, very near future. And you and I should probably talk. I know this is something that's interested you for a long time, and I've enjoyed some of your online work on it. But for now, I'm going to say the Pseudoterpene Chronicle. But I do want to actually follow through Christopher's ideas about a series of crusade-oriented handbooks and so forth. I want to kind of follow that stuff up as well. So it's something I hope to do probably in the next year or so.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So for our next question asker, and Jan, again, remember to introduce yourself.
You just did.
No, say your full name.
Hi, I'm Jan Marquardt. Lloyd, I have a question that came to me as you mentioned Minton was doing these reproduction tiles. And it occurred to me that I've seen so many in 19th century restorations, or maybe remodeling would be better, of churches when they replace them on the floors. And they look like that. They're clearly these images taken from the Crusader silk looks. I don't know how figural they are, but I know they're heraldic, if nothing else. Is this, can this be directly tied to the rise of conquest and colonialism in the 19th century? Are they thinking in these terms and so they're decorating that way, or are they just making sort of approximate medieval looks for their tiles?
It's a really interesting question and definitely one to think about more, but I don't have an answer for you immediately. It's not. Tiles are not really the thing I work on, absolutely, I'd just like to say. But it is a very interesting idea, the kind of rise of the reuse of these at exactly the moment that, I don't know, the scramble for Africa or what, how to read that. It's a very nice idea and definitely one to keep thinking of. I'm sure it'd be easy enough to find out if anyone ever speaks about it in those terms in their descriptions of Gothic restoration, but they probably somehow saw it as separate. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Betsy's up next. Full name, please.
Yeah. Hi. Okay, I'm going to back up. Hi, I'm Betsy Williams from Dumbarton Oaks. This is a question that Matthew, your paper prompted in my mind, looking at those pictures of wall paintings and the reproductions of wall paintings. And it suddenly dawned on me, thinking also about Euan's talk and about Nicholas, who's behind me's talk, that we've been talking so much about the textiles that people are bringing back with them, or that are being imported or traded or whatever into England. And when I was looking at those wall paintings, I couldn't help but think about, what textiles were they bringing with them back out to the Holy Land, or back out on their crusades. And I say that because I'm thinking of the Apocalypse tapestries and some of these early tapestries that are so closely tied to wall paintings, to what would be put on the wall, thinking about what Nicholas was talking about ephemeral objects that they're bringing and recreating around them. And I realize that this is primarily a textual question, which is why Euan is kind of coming to mind. So I just say that because it just comes to my mind. I come at it from the Eastern Mediterranean production, and you all are looking at it from whatever's going on in England. So thank you.
I think that's a question. It's a good one. So in terms of Edward in Westminster, there's quite a bit to say. His relationships with the Khans of Persia, we do have a series of documents in terms of diplomatic gifts that are sent. We know, for example, that Edward is nearly killed on the First Crusade of 1270. And there's actually a beautiful dagger we know quite a bit about it, that's actually kept on the high altar of Westminster Abbey as a kind of aspect of his crusading. So we do have a long list of these things, but there's nothing, frankly, that points absolutely. I mean, it would be lovely to have a kind of a smoking gun, so to speak, that said that this is precisely where this came. But as it is, I have an enormous file in my office that that actually recounts a whole series of these things. But as I say, they are fragments. There's nothing that really is an exact parallel or something like that. But I mean, certainly we have a number of objects, and that's why I think things like the Westminster Retable are so extraordinarily important, you know.
Nicholas, you're up.
It feels like people are coming to get mass, you know, it's like...
It's coming to pay homage. So I'm Nick Paul from Fordham. Thank you very much for a wonderful, very enriching session. I wanted to follow up in part on the promise to maybe say a little bit more about the images of Chertsey in the seals, but as part of a larger question about representations of architecture, I was curious about both the image of Chertsey in the seals and in the cartulary, and also the images of the temple in the wall paintings in the cycle, and also in some of the other the manuscript images of architecture in the manuscripts. My question is about the sort of symbolic architecture that gets used as the basis for some of these images. And in the case of the images of the temple, I was really struck by them. I've never really paid attention before to how the temple is being represented in art, and it seemed to me like it was a very tall, vertical tower type of building there, and it looked similar to representations of the Tower of David or the Royal Palace of Jerusalem in the Cambrai map of Jerusalem. And I didn't know whether there's a kind of reinvention of what the temple looks like in a crusading context as they're building new buildings, royal buildings in Jerusalem. And I guess with regard to the seal, is the image on the seal part of an idealized rebuilding of the Abbey, or does it reflect a typology of images of monasteries? I'll leave it there.
So yeah, very interesting question. I'm very happy to talk more about the images on the seals and in the map. So the two seals I show, one is, I think, 13th century, and then one is the start of the 16th century. But they show the same imagery in both of them. Now, the image on the map is slightly different, and that's because in the 14th century, the tower falls down, and the bells fall down, and the whole thing has to be rebuilt. So what is interesting, I think, is that they seem to be using the imagery that's on the seal consistently throughout, but the actual map potentially portrays a more realistic depiction of what it is in the 15th century. So the map sits in between the two instances of the seals. So I think it's simply that they have a seal. There's no need to go new matrix put together or commission. So they just keep using that, but the map is more accurate. Of course, whether it's entirely accurate or whether it's symbolic, I'm not an art historian, so I wouldn't want to go too far on that front, but I think it is practical more than anything.
But there is, I mean, it's a very, can I just jump in? Because I'm also really interested in the representation of architecture on seals. And the earliest known Anglo-Saxon seals, all for corporate institutions like Canterbury, Chertsey, and then post-conquest seals like Chichester, etc. They show buildings that look exactly like that. You know, triple-tiered towers, you know, a kind of a long nave with a thing on one side and then an apse on the other side. And I think it is absolutely linked to, say, Bede's description of the temple. Some of them even show kind of a pathway leading up to the door, and Bede talks about the pathway that led to the door. And so it's kind of reading architecture or reading, you know, descriptions of architecture through the temple. So I think it's highly stylized in order to evoke this total representation.
Symbolized in sensors, you know, when you look at the 3D sort of durables, it's the same kind of thing they represent.
Can I jump in quickly? I'm sorry, I can only hear a little bit here, but...
Yes, jump in.
Oh, sorry, there's a bit of lag, so I'm not quite sure. But no, this is a great question, and there's quite, in terms of the painted chamber anyway, there's a lot to say about this. And again, you know, in the absence of things like Henry III's paintings, I mean, what may have prepared kind of a visual imagination to this, we simply don't know. So that's kind of a problem. But the buildings themselves are contentious because it's been suggested by various people, most recently Christopher Wilson, that in fact the architecture in the painted chamber was updated. Everything else is basically Henry III, but the architecture was excuse me, updated in his time to reflect new trends and so forth and so on. That's kind of his argument for the dating, which I think is quite certainly not right. If we accept them as they are, as I believe the whole thing was, really late 13th century, that starts to make a little bit more sense. But your comment, I think, is absolutely true. Like, there's really not a lot that looks like that. And would we, outside of the actual textual identifications of it, really identify it as such? Maybe not, because really, these are incredibly sleek, urbane modern buildings. These are really the kind of the acme of a kind of an English approach to the Renaissance style. So in that respect, I mean, really they have just a couple of interesting features knocked on top. You know, it was said by various commentators, like Nicola Poggiabonsi, for example, talks about seeing, you know, the temple, and it has like, and all you really get out of this is that it has a lovely dome like a hat. You know, and that's the kind of thing that may have informed that strange kind of ogival dome, perhaps, you know. But as I say, it is a very unusual representation as far as we know for 13th century English representations of it. So it's a very good comment. Thank you.
Well, happily, we have time for one more question and only one more person waiting to ask one. So, and please don't forget to introduce yourself.
Sarah Thompson from Rochester Institute of Technology. And my question is about the uses of crusading imagery in England in military contexts of the 13th century. Edward I, you know, involved with conquest in Wales, involved with conquest in Scotland. Do we see this kind of imagery adapted? Do we see it used straightforwardly? Are there changes that are made to it, or is it avoided altogether?
Was that, who would you like to respond to your question? Everyone?
Anyone who would like to chime in.
Sarah, could you perhaps restate your question just a little bit? I wanted to make sure that I'm with you.
How is this kind of crusader imagery adapted in English military conquests of the 13th century that are happening, you know, between England and Wales, between England and Scotland?
It's a good question, and how to answer it's a bit tough. But one way into this, perhaps, is that in the case of Edward I, anyway, Edward's crusading was really stretched into his reputation, of course, as a warrior, as you suggest. And in the early 14th century, there are at least two important cycles, again, both of which are totally lost, but we do have good accounts of them, of essentially panegyric accounts of Edward's life. And these work like a chivalric biography, which takes you from, you know, him as a young man, his marriage, his wars, his crusades, blah, 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 to his death, you know, as you kind of wrap around a room. And those are really, really interesting and certainly requiring a little bit more work. But that would have been one place in which you kind of subsume those things into one coherent narrative. But again, we have only the descriptions.
Well, we're going to do two things before we wrap it up. After I close out the session and we applaud our speakers, Amanda's going to come up. So you're not going to leave. Amanda's going to come up and give an announcement about lunch. So this was an incredibly rich session. Thank you to our speakers, and also thank you to the people who asked questions.